No journey through a new aspect of artwork is going to ever be complete unless we take along a friend for the ride. So if you know me, you know I love skulls. Our little friend here is going to help cheerlead us all the way through. So let's say we have 3 of our friends here. Our friend at the bottom, they're going to be looking upward. Our friend in the middle is going to look straight ahead, and our friend at the top is going to be looking downward. All perspective is your point of view. And your point of view is what ends up determining the horizon line. So let's gather our friends for some more concrete examples. So standing where the earth meets the sky, if we look down, oddly enough, the horizon line gets higher because more ground is exposed to us. If we stay grounded and look straight ahead, it's even. And finally, if we look up, we are going to see more of the sky. So the horizon line is much lower. So let's get a horizon line again. And let's place some objects and see, even if we move the boxes, we always refer back to the spectrum of the horizon line. But why? Well, we actually have kind of an anchor for these floating objects. It's called a vanishing point. And this mark is what's responsible for guiding these objects to recede into space, into something that's called convergence. So what if the vanishing point changes? What happens then? All that's going to happen is the line of convergence is going to change and shift angles. So we're going to get different looking objects and shapes because our perspective changed. So we're back at the beginning, starting fresh. We're going to take our horizon line, place a vanishing point, super basic. It's going to be lots of squares on squares on squares, and I'm only going to worry about the details when we go in with ink. So we're going to have matching windows on both sides, and we're going to put in a door frame as well. The only thing that is not going to be flat, and that's going to really lend to a perspective in this situation, is the porch that I'm going to put in, which is going to overlap the building and kind of wrap around the sides of the house as well. And once that's all situated, then we can get into the details. So I'm going to take the opacity down and start tracing over it, using the horizon line as the grass, and then work in a sketchy outline in kind of a stylistic way of how I envision the house. And now I'm going to address the roof. So this also has a little bit peeking out that gives us an idea of perspective, but as I'm working, I'm realizing that it's lending to a sense of distortion. I really wasn't feeling how this roof is working out. I felt it was too high and I was afraid it was going to lend to some sense of distortion. So I decided to take the gutter of the roof down a little bit. And now this is the fun part. I wanted slats on the porch, and they're going to be coming towards us, of course, so I'm just following the lines of convergence and making those wooden slats appear. And some more scratchy elements to give a rustic lived-in feeling, not worrying too much about accuracy on the railings. The last thing that we can now attend to is develop a set of stairs that's in front of the house. We just have to locate our vanishing point. It's still there underneath the house even though we can't see it. And then we drag those converging lines and then create a new little box underneath it. And with that we draw those parallel lines to the horizon line to give us that stacking effect. And then we cut the sides off as it converges to the vanishing point. And then to continue building the landscape just in like a short form, just to sort of figure out what's going on, where they're living. I try to experiment with like the sloping hills, but I don't like the feeling of that. I prefer the more isolated, run-down look. This is a good start, But next we're going to go into 2-point perspective to see how this building can rotate and give us some more dynamic options. In the last section, we went over 1-point perspective, having a single vanishing point along the horizon line that directs our objects back into space. But what do we do if we want the building rotated? This is where 2-point perspective is now going to come into play. So as usual, we have our horizon line, and this time we're going to pick 2 vanishing points to place along that spectrum. So remember our converging lines that helped guide us with our shape? Well, now we're going to go a little bit extra and overboard, and I'm going to show you how, even though it may be visually confusing, how using these radiating lines from the center of our vanishing point is actually going to get you to make much more accurate and concise shapes and buildings. And by buildings, I don't mean like actual buildings, but I mean the objects in which we're creating. And we're going to do the same exercise, and we're going to pick a new color. Let's go with cyan to help us distinguish between our first vanishing point. So already, if you're new to this, even if you're not new to this can start to get very confusing and offsetting. Even though it's a grid to kind of help us determine what's going on, at face value, it's very disorienting. But I want to show you this slowly and step by step for us to sort of come along in a methodical manner so that once we have a firm understanding of what these points are actually doing, it's not that intimidating anymore. So now, to confuse things even more, I'm going to drag these vertical lines across here, which by now you may have absolutely no idea what's going on. But these vertical lines are going to help me build my rotated box with perpendicular accuracy as I create it in that 3D space, which recedes to both vanishing points. So here's my first line, and I'm dragging it across the vertical. And I'm making the first plane of the house on the left side that's going to vanishing point number 1. It is always going to return to that place of origin. Now I'm going to create the second plane of the house. I can drag that line past the point where I'm going to cut it off. It's just easily erased. You'll find in a lot of perspective drawings that going over where you actually are going to end your object is very common practice. So I'm going to change the composition of this scene just to build it out for an example. And this house is a little bit just too much in my face, so we're gonna change it. And I'm going to create the box a little bit more in the background, still using all my guiding perspective lines to build it out with accuracy. But what 2-point perspective is really great for is overlapping our shapes in really dynamic ways. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to build out a very scrappy, rough sketch of a car that is partially obstructing our view of the building in the background. In the super up-close foreground, I'm going to start to lay in an idea of plants or shrubbery, some kind of greenery, could even be different kinds of metals or something. Really buries the viewer to make them very self-aware that they are entering a world that has been kept away from others for a very long time. And you see I sort of dragged a tree line towards the first vanishing point. And then I decided to stop it with some more forestry in the back. Give the eye something else to travel to along the first vanishing point that's coming towards us, with some detritus or lawn junk or whatever these shapes may end up being in a more finished rendering. And so now we can see the composition really taking shape based off of our simple geometrics, a box, 2 dots and a line. Now that we're not just layering boxes and boxes upon each other, we actually have items that have some sort of narrative or meaning to them, such as the overgrown shrubbery, the broken down car, and then the house in the background. This layering effect already tells us a story. It tells us that no one's around the property, it's not being taken care of, and who could possibly live in this house that has been isolated and abandoned for so long. Using two-point perspective gives tons of variety on how you choose your focus for a frame. Sometimes, yes, it just looks cool, but maybe how we open on the car can be used as a foreshadowing as to how Grandma will be rescued in the future. And we can trick the audience in believing it's just part of the overall scene in the beginning, where really it can end up being the crux of the story, which is what lends to the most interesting twists and turns that narratives can take. It's in this that we see our visual choices really matter, not only in creating compositions, but also they add to the story in very significant ways that can bring our narrative to the next level. So to recap the last lesson, we took a look at the horizon line and how now in two-point perspective, we have two vanishing points that are going to structure our scene. Then we added our guidelines from both vanishing points and the verticals to keep our lines perpendicular and accurate. We then scoped out how to build a scene from there. And with all this in mind, let's move into three-point perspective. Within three-point perspective, there are two ways in which we can craft our scenes. One is from the worm's eye view.
Hello.
And the other is from the bird's eye view. So let's take a look at what that means. In each of these examples, our position, like in the others, can change. But the difference is that as a worm, our vantage point does not ever pass above the horizon line. And for the bird's eye view, it does not pass below the horizon line. The worm's eye view, everything that is your focal point is being dragged up. And with a bird's eye view, everything is being dragged down. How does this differ from two-point, right? Because we could always place the box wherever we wanted, and we could see the bottom or the top. Remember how the vanishing points lead our eye determine the entire scope of the picture plane. So in two-point perspective, our line of focus is always in the direction to or from the two vanishing points. Whereas in our three-point perspective, our line of sight doesn't direct us to the sides. It directs us up or down, with the two-point vanishing points reinforcing this direction and focal point. Because it is about seeing it from below or above, not from over and under. I know that might sound confusing, but once you see it, it's all going to make sense. So I'll begin with a worm's eye view first. I have my dual vanishing points here, and I'm going to put the horizon line above the picture plane outside of the canvas. So I'm going to drag a vertical line to help me place my lines, and then I'm just going to continue to build a high building that we actually don't see the tip or point of. Now I'm going to design a path that leads to the building. And this can further lead the viewer in by your design choices. So not only do we have a very large spectacle placed pretty far away from us, but still looming over us, we have now this path that's guiding our eye line and reinforcing what is in front of us is pretty important and a big part of the story. So we're going to move the horizon line up and begin to develop the same structural scene, but with a vantage point that is where we are above the roof of the building that we just saw in the distance. The main point I want you to take home is that vantage points or perspective is not just about something that looks cool. It has a direct impact on how the story is read and interpreted without exposition or dialogue. For example, perhaps we start our main character's goal to be at the top of this building, and the whole story arc is about this accomplishment. It wouldn't make much sense then to keep all of our shots at ground level and to wrap up only with, "Oh yay, I made it by the way," but to end on the vantage point of that accomplishment. will show the journey and reward the audience for sticking along with the story to its resolve. Hopping in, I'm making a series of random horizon lines, and you'll notice I only put one vanishing point because honestly, to get started, as you see, I work in a combination of viewpoints from things that just kind of occur to me along the way. This is an example of how, with experience, you start to envision your rough ideas with a built-in dimension. Now I'm going to be assessing what I do and don't want, and I can tell right away that I just don't want the middle one. I don't think it's the best way to start out the story the way that I see it in my head. The vantage point is weird. I don't like the overhead, like it's from a bird's eye view that much, so we're gonna cut it out. I don't like the one right next to it either. I don't feel it's a strong establishing shot. Maybe for something down the line, like if we were doing a pan across the railing of the porch as we follow somebody, or reveal a corner turn or something, or there's something in the distance that we're going to focus on. But like for establishing the general scene, I don't really like this, so I'm going to have to cut it out. And this one down here, you know, I just don't like it, so it's gonna go. And this fellow right here, it makes me feel like I'm in some sort of like trippy spiral land, so we're gonna cut that out. I'm not going for a psychedelic feeling here. As for this frame, I like it. However, I feel like this angle is a little bit too steep and extreme, for lack of a better word, but I do like the general setup and the birds in the background. I don't want to completely exit out right now, so it's going to stay for now, and then I'm going to move on to eliminate another one first. So I'm really partial of shots where your view is obstructed, but again, this is the slats, the side of the house, but it's not going to offer me anything for an establishing shot unless in the background there's like someone coming up to the house and then we switch to another viewpoint, but it's not going to give me a real sense of the environment. But it is a frame or shot I'd like to include maybe in the future, so we're going to keep it in the back of our head, but eliminate it from our final frame. Now we're down to 4, and there's a lot of similarities between these two, and I just don't like the way that it cuts off at the top. I do like the background here where it gives more of an environment situation and where they live and the context and how it might be isolated, but it's not as good as the one on the far right. I feel like this has way more space to breathe, and it also harkens back to the aspect in the extreme view that I liked as well. I think I'm going to be eliminating this one because it really doesn't do anything again for me unless there's like something going on in the window or someone in the window that we can sort of push into and reveal. I do like the gentleness of the smoke coming out, so that can be part of what I put in my final frame. I don't know, there's just something about it that's not, giving me the good stuff, so I'm gonna have to say no. So kind of by default, we have our friend here as the winner. I think the open space really lends to the atmosphere that I'm trying to develop and to give a sense of the family that lives in the house. I imagine that as moonlight, and so we'll see what kind of gentleness we can really pump up in the final frame. I see a lot of similarities here to the one that I'm working on now, except I don't like the chunky stuff in the foreground. It's really not working for the mood I want to set. I want more of a genteel or serene vibe, but I do like the extreme angle still, so I'm going to keep in mind some of those aspects and then maybe combine the two concepts together for my final frame and then see how we can move forward with that. at the final place before picking our final frame for the project. This setup that I have right here is helpful if you're a little indecisive about which direction to take, and it's also good to compare your contrasting ideas. But you can use the notes area for anything: sudden ideas, the past details, brainstorming, and a little later on you'll see how I utilize it. So I wanted to return to the one-point perspective just because I feel like I missed taking advantage of that viewpoint in our previous frame layouts. And it occurred to me that maybe simpler is going to be better for my establishing shot in the end. Even though it's common, I play here with the tree line guiding the eye to the house and setting some tonality with like a variety of grays. Here I'll overlay the structure I intended, and you can see that with some practice, these fundamentals will just become a part of how you operate in creating compositions. There's so many ways in which we can implement perspective, so eventually it just comes down to you and your own creative process and workflow. During the duration of this sketch, a few things came to me that I may implement in the final. I go over to my notes section and I take a step back and assess my initial idea, jotting down what works as well as any criticisms I may have of the piece. It's important to have a dialogue with yourself because we may not have outside feedback, or if we're tasked with a deadline, there may not be a lot of time to be indecisive. And as much as the bend of the trees flow to the house, I feel it makes the frame more cramped. So I give myself the suggestion of switching the direction of the trees to insinuate that visual flow from outside the frame to the next panel, which suggests the expanse is not only to the property, but also to the story itself. So now on to the frame that I planned for a 2-point perspective. And as you can see, I adjusted it. And as I went along, I sort of was reshaping in my head how I saw it on the page. But I still ended up being stuck in the same compositional ideas of the example from the actual 2-point perspective example I gave in that lesson, which is something that I needed to break away from so that my thoughts and ideas and constructions don't all look alike. In general, this leads to very static, predictable visual storytelling, which doesn't always do harm, but it can make a story that could be exceptional stay in a very constrictive space. And sometimes you'll find in this process of trying to funnel exactly what you see in your mind that may not even be correlated to what you're trying to achieve, a new idea is going to spring to life. And that's exactly what happened to me as I was laying down these lines that you can see here. When this new idea popped into my head, I also consciously tried to draw in a different way, blocking out the loose shapes in value rather than sketching with line or setting up my perspective grid immediately. This gives me an opportunity to connect with a more painterly approach that can be overlaid later with a grid for better accuracy. My goal here is to chase an emotional tone over a realistic vantage point, and I feel I'm getting closer to the final piece when I let my hours of work combine with a more intuitive state of mind. And now for the usual, I make some notes to myself about what I see for the actual final establishing shot and what I could make more clear. And I head on to the final analysis of my establishing shot. So now that the final comparison is complete, I've made my choice and it's ready to go on to the final establishing shot. So let's go. Hi, and welcome back to the final project. Yay! Now that I've secured my final image, I'm going to use it to plot the final frame, setting up my perspective grid with my horizon line and my vanishing points. before I get going into the fun details which will help build this world. Once this is all set up, I start in on a line sketch that will set up some of the more subtle things, such as the curvature of the earthy hill that the house is resting on. It's key for me to stay away from using the box-like buildings in this stage. Since the scene here is placed in nature, I select this specific kind of line quality to echo the natural fluidity found in organic spaces and things. Once I have this all locked in, I start using values to introduce spatial depth. I play around with how I want the character of the house to come across as, but don't overcommit by tightening up all the detail at once. Not yet. After laying in that grounding value, I look to find another solution that is going to act as a visual guide to sustain the right side of the canvas as the focal point. Now I'm going to sharpen up my lighting details, creating more contrast and utilizing the values against each other to address those textures that I don't plan on outlining when I do the passive ink. One important aspect to note is that just because something is in shadow doesn't mean that it blends in or that the textural components disappear. All things are affected by light or its absence. So always address the areas in which the ambient or direct light isn't as strong. Of course, there are stylistic exceptions to this, but generally, it's a good rule of thumb to follow. And now is the time that I tell you that I have led you astray to believe that we almost might be finished. But for me, this tonal layout is just so that I can set the stage for the inking process, reducing my work from the last hour down to an opacity layer to adjust after the ink brush is laid down. Here, I'm realigning my perspective grid because now I'm actually committing to the line work for stability. I make sure to keep the principles of line weight distribution in check, pressure, taper, thickness, blobs, and fills to vary the scene, composing some of these elements again against each other for that dynamic juxtaposition, which is always in nature, always in our natural world, and really can lead to visual variety within a single frame. The final hours of the work for me is the most fun. I really get to play with value and deal with the lighting effects that are super exciting and can bring moods to your final project that you perhaps maybe had not initially planned on, or at least provide different kinds of versions of those moods to begin with. I know who I am as an artist, and I tend to favor more brooding, dramatic pieces, and because of this, I have a tendency to have a heavier hand with my values, so working digitally in layers, I always have multiple versions of a final, especially if it's going to be for client work. Because in my experience, we only get to see which one works the best for the story's intention when it is compared along with other options.